Harold Thompson stood at his kitchen window on a peaceful Monday morning, his weathered hands wrapped around a warm coffee mug. At 93 years old, his daily routine was as predictable as the sunrise. Every morning at exactly 6:30 a.m., he would wake up, put on his favorite blue cardigan, and make his first cup of coffee of the day. The morning sun cast long shadows across his beloved rose garden, where 36 rose bushes bloomed in neat rows. Each plant had been carefully chosen and tended to over the past 15 years, ever since his dear wife Martha had passed away. The roses were more than just flowers to Harold. They were his connection to the happy memories of his past. His small white house sat at the end of Maple Street, where he had lived for the past 45 years. It wasn't a fancy home, but it was his pride and joy. The paint was always fresh, the lawn was always mowed, and the American flag flew proudly from the front porch, a reminder of his service in World War II. As Harold prepared to take his usual morning walk through his garden, he noticed something different. The empty lot next door, which had been quiet for years, now had 3 motorcycles parked on it. The sight made him pause. In all his years living here, that lot had only been used for neighborhood children playing ball or flying kites. Strange, Harold muttered to himself, adjusting his glasses to get a better look. The motorcycles were big, black, and shiny. Their chrome parts gleamed in the morning sun. Harold tried not to let this small change bother him as he stepped outside onto his front porch. The morning air was cool and fresh, carrying the sweet scent of his roses. He carefully made his way down the 3 porch steps, using his wooden cane for support. His legs weren't as strong as they used to be, but he refused to let that stop him from his daily garden inspection. Just as he reached his first rose bush, the roar of engines shattered the morning peace. 5 more motorcycles turned onto his street, their engines so loud that the windows of his house rattled. Harold watched as they pulled into the empty lot, kicking up dust and small rocks that scattered across his driveway. The riders were young men dressed in black leather jackets covered in patches and symbols Harold didn't recognize. They were nothing like the military motorcycle units he remembered from his service days. These men were loud, rough, and seemed to care little for the quiet neighborhood around them. Harold checked his watch. It was only 7:15 a.m. Mrs. Peterson next door had a new baby who would surely be woken by this noise. Across the street, old Mr. Jenkins was recovering from heart surgery and needed his rest. This wasn't right, Harold thought to himself. More motorcycles arrived over the next hour. Harold counted 15 of them now, their riders talking loudly and laughing. Empty beer cans appeared, rolling across the lot and into his yard. The peaceful morning he had looked forward to was completely ruined. Inside his house, Harold looked at the old photographs on his wall. There he was, standing proud in his military uniform in 1944. Another photo showed him with his motorcycle unit, back when he served as a messenger during the war. Those were different times, when motorcycles meant freedom and service to one's country, not disruption and disrespect. He sat in his favorite armchair, watching through the window as more bikers arrived. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten on the side table. The roses would have to wait for their morning inspection. For the first time in many years, Harold's routine was broken. As he listened to the growing noise outside, Harold felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, a mix of anger and determination. He had faced bigger challenges in his life than a group of noisy bikers. He had survived a war, built a life from nothing, and taken care of his wife until her last day. This new problem might be unexpected, but Harold Thompson was not a man who gave up easily. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a situation that would soon change not only his quiet life, but also the lives of everyone involved in unexpected ways. A week had passed since the bikers first appeared, and Harold hadn't slept properly since then. Every morning, the motorcycles would arrive at sunrise, and often they wouldn't leave until well after dark. The constant noise was like a hammer hitting his nerves, hour after hour, day after day. On this particular morning, Harold stood in front of his bathroom mirror, looking at his reflection. His blue eyes, though tired from lack of sleep, still held the same determination they had during the war. He opened his dresser drawer and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside were his military medals, bronze stars and silver badges that told the story of his service. With slightly shaking hands, he carefully pinned them to his cardigan. "Time to face this head-on," he said to himself, remembering how his old commanding officer always said that running from trouble only makes it grow bigger. Harold walked outside, using his cane for support. The morning air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of motor oil. 20 bikers were gathered in the lot, their motorcycles parked in a messy circle. Empty food wrappers and crushed cans littered the ground, some blown onto his property by the wind. As Harold approached the group, he stood as straight as his old back would allow. A few of the bikers noticed him coming and nudged their friends, pointing and snickering. Harold kept walking until he reached the edge of the lot. "Good morning, gentlemen," he said, his voice clear and strong despite his age. "I'd like to have a word with whoever's in charge here." A tall man with a thick beard and tattooed arms stepped forward. He wore a leather vest with the name Snake stitched across the back. Snake looked down at Harold, a mocking smile on his face. Well, what do we have here? The neighborhood watch?" Snake said, causing his friends to laugh. His eyes landed on Harold's medals. "Nice pins, Grandpa. Yard sale finds?" Harold felt his face grow warm, but he kept his voice steady. "These medals were earned defending this country. I'm here because your group has been disturbing the peace in our neighborhood. We have families with young children, elderly residents who need their rest." "Oh, boo-hoo," Snake interrupted, walking closer to Harold. "Public property, old-timer. We can be here if we want to be." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a set of keys, and walked to his motorcycle. Harold continued, "I'm not asking you to leave permanently, just to show some respect for the neighborhood. Maybe meet somewhere else during early morning and late night hours." The sudden roar of Snake's engine drowned out Harold's words. Snake revved the motorcycle repeatedly, creating a deafening noise that made Harold's windows rattle. Other bikers joined in, their combined engines creating a wall of sound that forced Harold to step back. "Sorry, what was that?" Snake shouted over the noise, cupping his hand to his ear. "Can't hear you over all this peace disturbing." The other bikers laughed and cheered. One of them, a younger man with a red bandana, walked over to Harold's property line and deliberately tossed an empty can onto his lawn. Harold stood there, gripping his cane tightly. He watched as more trash was thrown onto his yard, as the bikers made exaggerated bowing motions and called out "Yes, sir," and "Sorry, sir," in mocking tones. His medals, symbols of courage and sacrifice, gleamed in the morning sun while young men who had never known war laughed at them. Finally, Harold turned and walked back to his house. Behind him, the bikers celebrated their victory with more engine revving and loud hoots. As he reached his front door, he heard Snake shout, "See you tomorrow, Cramps. Better get some earplugs." Inside his house, Harold's hands were shaking as he carefully unpinned his medals. He placed them back in their wooden box, closing the lid gently. On his wall, a photograph of his old motorcycle unit caught his eye. Young men in uniform stood proudly next to their bikes, ready to serve their country. Harold looked at his younger self in the photo, then at the scene outside his window where the bikers continued their noisy gathering. This confrontation had gone badly, but Harold Thompson hadn't survived a war by giving up after one failed battle. As he watched the bikers through his window, a plan began forming in his mind. One that would surprise everyone, especially Snake and his gang. The next 2 weeks brought changes to Harold's once peaceful property that made his heart ache. What started as simple noise harassment had grown into something much worse. The bikers, led by Snake, had decided to make Harold's life as difficult as possible. It began with the roses. Harold discovered tire tracks through his garden one morning, 3 of his most beautiful rose bushes crushed beneath the heavy weight of motorcycle wheels. He stood there in his morning robe, looking at the destroyed plants he had tended for 15 years. These weren't just roses. They were the same variety his late wife Martha had planted when they first moved in. "Just an accident," Snake had called out from the lot, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "These bikes have a mind of their own sometimes." The other bikers laughed, revving their engines in celebration of their cruelty. Harold wasn't a man who gave up easily. He spent that afternoon installing security cameras on his property. They were expensive, but his grandson Tommy had helped him order them online. "These will catch them if they try anything else, Grandpa," Tommy had assured him over the phone. But Snake and his gang were clever. They parked their motorcycles right at the edge of Harold's property line, just inches away from being caught on camera. The noise was even worse now. They would start their engines early in the morning and let them run for hours. Black exhaust smoke drifted into Harold's yard, making it impossible for him to sit outside. Mrs. Peterson next door, the young mother, tried to help. She called the police twice, but the bikers would quiet down when the patrol car drove by, only to start up again the moment it left. The police said they couldn't do much since the bikers were on public property and technically not breaking any laws. One particularly bad morning, Harold found all his trash cans knocked over, garbage scattered across his driveway. As he bent down slowly to pick up the mess, his old joints protesting every movement, he heard Snake call out, "Need some help there, old-timer? Maybe it's time to move to a retirement home." The harassment continued throughout the day. When Harold tried to get his mail, two bikers would race their motorcycles up and down the street, coming so close to his mailbox that he had to wait inside until they got bored. When he attempted to water what was left of his garden, they would rev their engines and blow exhaust smoke his way. That evening, Harold watched from his window as more bikers arrived. The group had grown larger. He counted 30 motorcycles now. The empty lot looked like a motorcycle showroom, except messier and louder. Empty beer cans and food wrappers littered the ground, and the grass was dying under the constant weight of parked bikes. The final straw came just before sunset. Harold was inside, trying to watch his favorite evening news program, when he heard a loud crash. He hurried to his front door as fast as his legs would carry him and found his mailbox lying on the ground, knocked completely off its post. His mail was scattered across the street, some letters already ruined by passing cars. "Oops." Snake's voice carried across the lot. "Looks like someone had an accident. Maybe you should get a stronger mailbox, Gramps." Harold's hands shook as he picked up his fallen mail. Among the scattered letters was a card from his granddaughter Sarah. The envelope was torn and tire-marked, the birthday message inside crumpled. He had been looking forward to reading it all day. Back inside his house, Harold sat in his study, surrounded by photographs from his military days. His eyes moved from picture to picture, young men standing proud next to their motorcycles, ready to serve their country. These photos had always brought him comfort, but tonight they sparked something else, an idea. In one particular photo, taken in 1944, Harold stood next to his military motorcycle, surrounded by his unit. They were the elite motorcycle division of the military police, respected and feared throughout Europe. As he looked at this photo, his hands stopped shaking. A plan began to form in his mind, one that would require just one phone call, but would change everything. Snake and his gang thought they knew everything about the quiet old man whose life they were making miserable. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. That evening, Harold sat alone in his study, his hands still dirty from picking up the scattered mail. The room was growing dark, but he hadn't bothered to turn on the lights. Outside, the bikers' voices and motorcycle engines created their usual chaos, but Harold barely heard them now. His mind was somewhere else, somewhere far in the past. His eyes moved across the walls of his study, each photograph telling a story from his military days. There he was at 19, standing tall in his fresh uniform. Another showed him receiving a medal for bravery under fire, but it was the large photograph above his desk that held his attention tonight. The black and white image showed 20 young men in military uniforms, standing proudly next to their motorcycles. It was taken in England, just before D-Day in 1944. Harold was in the front row, his helmet tucked under his arm, a confident smile on his face. They were the 517th Military Police Motorcycle Division, one of the most respected units in the European theater. Harold slowly stood up from his chair, his joints stiff from sitting too long. He walked closer to the photograph, using his cane for support. With his free hand, he wiped away the thin layer of dust that had gathered on the frame. Each face in the photo seemed to look back at him, young men who had ridden their motorcycles through danger to deliver critical messages, coordinate troop movements, and maintain order behind enemy lines. "We were something else, weren't we, boys?" Harold whispered to the photograph. His finger traced across the faces of his old friends. Johnson, Miller, Rodriguez, he named each one, remembering their voices, their laughs, their courage. A particularly loud engine rev from outside made his windows rattle, bringing him back to the present. Harold turned toward his window, watching as Snake and his gang continued their harassment of the neighborhood. They were nothing like the proud riders he had served with. These men used their motorcycles to intimidate and destroy, not to serve and protect. Harold's eyes fell on his old military trunk in the corner of the study. He hadn't opened it in years, but tonight felt different. Using his cane for balance, he knelt down slowly and lifted the heavy lid. The smell of old leather and oil filled the air as he pulled out his old riding jacket. It was still stiff and strong, the military police patches slightly faded but clearly visible. Underneath the jacket, wrapped in an old cloth, was his most prized possession, his rider's logbook. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside were hundreds of entries detailing every mission he'd ridden, every message delivered, every life potentially saved by getting crucial information where it needed to go. But more importantly, in the back of the book was a list of names and numbers, his old military contacts. Harold had always kept in touch with his unit members over the years. Even as their numbers grew smaller, those who remained made sure to stay connected. They understood the bond that was formed during those dangerous rides across Europe. A loud crash from outside made Harold jump. Looking out his window, he saw that the bikers had knocked over his trash cans again. Snake was standing there, laughing and pointing as garbage spilled across the driveway. This time, they had gone too far. Harold looked back at the photograph of his motorcycle unit, then down at the list of numbers in his logbook. His eyes settled on one name in particular, James Thunder Martinez. Last he'd heard, Thunder was the president of the largest veterans motorcycle association in the country. They had ridden together during the war, saving each other's lives more than once. With determination in his eyes, Harold reached for his phone. His hands weren't shaking anymore. The noise outside seemed to fade away as he dialed the number he hadn't called in years. As the phone rang, Harold looked once more at the photograph of his old unit. Snake and his gang thought they knew motorcycles, but they were about to meet some real riders. The phone clicked as someone picked up on the other end. Thunder? It's Harold Thompson from the 517th. Remember those rides we took through France? Well, old friend, I need your help with something. The phone line crackled as Harold heard his old friend's voice for the first time in years. Harold Thompson, is that really you, old-timer? Thunder's voice was deeper than Harold remembered, but it still carried the same warmth from their service days. It's me, Thunder. Been a long time, Harold said, settling into his armchair. Outside, the bikers were still making noise, but Harold focused on his conversation. He explained everything to Thunder: the harassment, the destroyed roses, the knocked-over mailbox, and the constant noise that had turned his peaceful retirement into a nightmare. Thunder listened quietly, only interrupting once to ask, "These boys got a leader?" "Goes by Snake." When Harold confirmed this, Thunder let out a low whistle. "Known troublemakers. They've been causing problems all over the state." Harold gripped the phone tighter. "I tried talking to them, Thunder. Showed them my medals, tried to reason with them. They just laughed." His voice grew softer as he added, "They're nothing like what we used to be." There was a moment of silence on the other end. Then Thunder spoke, his voice filled with purpose. "Harold, you remember that time in France, when those German scouts had us pinned down, and you rode through their line to get help?" "Of course I remember," Harold said, looking at the medal he'd earned that day, still in its case on his desk. "Scariest ride of my life." "And you did it anyway," Thunder said. "Because that's what our motorcycle division stood for. We helped people, we protected them." He paused before adding, "We still do." Harold heard Thunder shuffling some papers. "I'm president of the Veterans Motorcycle Association now. Got chapters in every state, good men and women who still believe in what we fought for." Another pause. "Give me 48 hours, Harold. I'm going to make some calls." For the next hour, Harold shared more details with Thunder. He told him about Mrs. Peterson and her baby who couldn't sleep, about Mr. Jenkins recovering from heart surgery, about all the neighbors who were suffering but felt helpless to do anything. "These young punks," Thunder growled. "They think having a motorcycle makes them tough. They forgot what real riders stand for." Harold could hear him typing on a computer. "I'm sending messages to all our local chapters right now. We got over 3,000 members in your state alone." Harold's eyes widened. "Thunder, I don't want to cause any trouble." Thunder's laugh boomed through the phone. "Trouble? Harold, you rode messages through enemy territory for 2 years. You helped establish our first motorcycle courier routes after the war. Half the protocols our organization uses today came from your experience." His voice grew serious. "You're not just any veteran, Harold. You're one of the founding fathers of modern military motorcycle operations." As they talked, Thunder's plan began to take shape. He was contacting not just local chapters, but riders from 3 neighboring states. "We'll show these boys what real motorcycle culture looks like," he said. "And we'll teach them about respect." Harold found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. He could hear Thunder making more calls even as they talked, his voice occasionally muffled as he spoke to others in his office. "Day after tomorrow, Harold," Thunder said finally. "When do these troublemakers usually show up?" "Around 9 in the morning," Harold replied. "They like to wake up the whole neighborhood." "Perfect. We'll be there at 8:30. Thunder's voice carried a hint of amusement. "And Harold, wear your old riding jacket. The one with the MP patches. I think these young fellows need a history lesson." As Harold hung up the phone, he looked out his window one more time. Snake and his gang were still there, oblivious to what was coming. They had no idea that their actions had set in motion something much bigger than their petty harassment. Harold opened his closet and pulled out his old leather riding jacket. It was well worn but still sturdy, the military police patches standing out against the dark leather. In less than 2 days, everything would change. Snake and his gang were about to learn that they had picked the wrong veteran to bully. 2 days later, Harold woke up earlier than usual. His hands trembled slightly as he buttoned his shirt and put on his old riding jacket. The leather was stiff from years in the closet, but it still fit. In the mirror, he saw a glimpse of his younger self, the brave motorcycle messenger who had ridden through war-torn Europe. At exactly 8:15 a.m., he heard the first rumble. It wasn't the harsh, angry sound of Snake's gang. This was different, a deep, rolling thunder that seemed to come from all directions. Harold walked to his front window and smiled. Motorcycles were appearing from every street that led to his neighborhood. They came in pairs, then groups of 10, then dozens. These weren't the flashy, modified bikes that Snake's gang rode. These were serious machines, many decorated with American flags and military insignias. Their riders wore clean leather vests covered in military patches and service medals. By 8:30 a.m., over 200 veterans had parked their motorcycles in perfect lines along both sides of the street. Harold watched in amazement as they dismounted and stood at attention beside their bikes. Some were young veterans from recent conflicts, others were older men who had served in Vietnam, and a few were even Korean War veterans. At 8:45 a.m., a familiar figure rode up on a massive black motorcycle. James Thunder Martinez, now in his 70s but still imposing, parked his bike and walked up to Harold's front door. The two old friends embraced, tears in their eyes. "Still got that same jacket, I see," Thunder said, patting Harold's shoulder. "Ready to show these boys what real riders look like?" Around 9:00 a.m., Snake and his gang began to arrive. Harold watched as their faces changed from confusion to concern. Instead of their usual empty lot, they found a wall of motorcycles and stern-faced veterans blocking their way. Snake tried to act tough, revving his engine loudly as he approached. But his usual swagger disappeared when Thunder stepped forward, his vest displaying rows of combat medals and patches identifying him as the Veterans Motorcycle Association president. "Morning, boys," Thunder's voice boomed across the street. "Heard you've been giving one of our own a hard time." He gestured toward Harold, who stood straight and proud in his MP jacket. The veterans moved in perfect formation, creating a protective semicircle around Harold's property. Each bike gleamed in the morning sun, their chrome polished to mirror shine. American flags mounted on their back fluttered in the breeze. Snake looked around nervously. His gang of 30 seemed small now, surrounded by hundreds of combat veterans. The empty lot they had claimed as their territory was filled with rows of motorcycles, each one representing years of service and sacrifice. One of Snake's younger members tried to make a joke, but his laugh died quickly when a Vietnam veteran stepped forward, his chest covered in combat medals. "Something funny, son?" the veteran asked quietly. The young biker shook his head and stepped back. Harold watched as more veterans arrived. They came from 3 different states, Thunder explained. Word had spread through their network about a World War II veteran being harassed, and they had responded in force. Some had ridden through the night to be there. The contrast between the two groups couldn't have been more striking. Snake's gang, with their loud pipes and aggressive attitude, looked amateur next to the disciplined veterans. These men and women had ridden motorcycles in combat zones, delivered critical messages under fire, and served their country with honor. Mrs. Peterson came out of her house, holding her baby. She stared in amazement at the scene before her. Mr. Jenkins watched from his window, a proud smile on his face. Other neighbors began to emerge, taking pictures and watching in awe as more veterans arrived. Thunder turned to Harold and winked. "Think it's time for that history lesson we talked about?" he asked. Harold nodded, straightening his jacket. For the first time in weeks, he felt truly at peace. Snake and his gang were about to learn what real motorcycle culture was all about, and why you should never underestimate a 93-year-old veteran who once rode through enemy lines to save his friends. The real lesson was just about to begin. Thunder stepped forward, his voice carrying across the now silent street. Every eye was on him as he stood between Snake's gang and the assembled veterans. But instead of anger or threats, Thunder did something unexpected. He smiled. "Let me tell you boys a story," he said, gesturing toward Harold. "That man you've been harassing, the one whose roses you destroyed and whose mail you scattered, he's not just any veteran. He's a legend in the motorcycle world." Thunder pulled out his phone and showed them a photograph he had brought, a copy of the same one that hung in Harold's study. "France, 1944. See that young man there? That's Harold Thompson, one of the most skilled riders in the military police motorcycle division." Snake and his gang leaned forward despite themselves, looking at the black and white image of young Harold on his military motorcycle. Their faces showed confusion, then growing interest as Thunder continued. "You boys think you know motorcycles?" Thunder asked. "Harold here rode through enemy territory carrying messages that helped win the war. No headlights allowed at night, navigating by moonlight, dodging enemy patrols. One wrong turn meant capture or worse." Harold stepped forward, his riding jacket catching the morning sun. His voice was clear and strong as he added, "We didn't ride to make noise or cause trouble. We rode because lives depended on us getting those messages through." An older veteran from the crowd spoke up. "After the war, Harold here helped establish the first motorcycle courier routes across Europe. The routes and techniques he developed are still used by military riders today." He pointed to a manual attached to his bike. "His methods are literally written in our training books." Snake shifted uncomfortably on his feet as Thunder continued. "That's not all. In 1946, Harold was one of the founding members of our organization. He helped write our code of conduct, taught countless veterans how to ride safely, and showed us that motorcycles could be used to serve our communities." More veterans stepped forward, each sharing stories they had heard about Harold's service. Some had trained using his techniques, others had ridden the very routes he had mapped out decades ago. With each story, Snake's gang seemed to shrink into themselves, their earlier bravado completely gone. "You know what Harold did after the war?" Thunder asked, his voice growing softer. "He came home and served his community. Helped fellow veterans, volunteered at hospitals, taught young people about motorcycle safety. Those roses you destroyed? He planted them with his wife Martha, who spent 30 years volunteering at the VA hospital." Several of Snake's gang members removed their helmets, looking ashamed. Some of them had veterans in their own families, and the reality of what they had been doing was finally hitting home. "But here's the really interesting part," Thunder said, walking closer to Snake. "Harold here could have called the police, could have pressed charges for harassment and vandalism. Instead, he called me because he saw something in you boys, something that reminded him of young riders he used to train." Harold nodded, stepping forward with his cane. "You love motorcycles," he said to Snake and his gang. "So did we, still do. But we learned to use that love for something bigger than ourselves." Snake looked at Harold, really looked at him for the first time. He saw past the age, past the cane, and recognized something he had missed before: the quiet strength of a man who had faced real challenges and emerged stronger. We didn't know," Snake said quietly, looking at the ground, "about any of this." "No, you didn't," Thunder agreed. "But now you do. So the question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge?" The morning sun was high now, shining down on both groups, the young bikers and the veteran riders. In that moment, something shifted. The divide between them didn't seem quite so wide anymore. Harold watched as Snake took off his leather vest, walked forward, and held out his hand. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice heavy with regret, "I believe we owe you an apology, a big one." The veterans watched silently as Harold looked at Snake's outstretched hand. This was more than just an apology. It was an opportunity to bridge a gap between generations of riders. The lesson Harold had hoped to teach was finally being learned. Harold reached out and shook Snake's hand firmly, a gesture that marked the beginning of an unexpected transformation in their neighborhood. The veterans watching from their motorcycles nodded in approval, seeing a teaching moment unfold before them. "Your apology is accepted," Harold said, his voice gentle but firm. "Now, how about we put all that energy of yours to better use?" Over the next few hours, something remarkable happened on Maple Street. Snake and his gang, under the guidance of the veterans, began cleaning up the empty lot they had littered for weeks. They picked up every can, wrapper, and piece of trash. Some borrowed rakes from neighbors to clean up the tire marks they had left in the grass. But the real surprise came when Snake approached Harold with an uncertain look on his face. "Mr. Thompson," he said, scratching his head, "I noticed you know a lot about motorcycles. Would you maybe teach us some of what you learned? The real way to ride?" Harold's eyes lit up. Here was the opportunity he had been waiting for. "First lesson," he said with a smile, "starts in my garden. Those roses need replanting." And so began a new chapter on Maple Street. Every Saturday morning, instead of causing chaos, Snake's gang would gather at Harold's house for what became known as Veterans Coffee and Stories. They would help tend the garden first, Harold teaching them the patience and care needed to grow roses, and then they would sit on his porch, drinking coffee and listening to stories from the veterans who now regularly visited. Thunder made sure different veterans showed up each week, each bringing their own experiences and wisdom to share. The young riders learned about motorcycle maintenance, safe riding techniques, and the importance of using their skills to help others. Mrs. Peterson no longer worried about her baby being woken by noise. Instead, she found herself bringing cookies to the Saturday gatherings, her little one becoming a favorite among the riders. Mr. Jenkins, recovered from his surgery, would often join them, sharing his own stories from his time in the Korean War. The empty lot was transformed too. Snake and his gang, with help from the veterans, turned it into a proper motorcycle meeting spot. They installed benches, planted trees for shade, and even put up a flagpole where the American flag flew proudly. A small memorial plaque was placed there, honoring Harold's service and the 517th Military Police Motorcycle Division. The most significant change was in Snake himself. Under Harold's mentoring, he discovered a new purpose. He organized motorcycle safety courses for local teens, teaching them the responsible way to ride. His gang members, once known for causing trouble, began escorting veteran funeral processions and participating in charity rides. 1 year later, on Harold's 94th birthday, the transformation was complete. His garden had twice as many roses as before, now tended by young hands eager to learn. The Veterans Motorcycle Association made him an honorary lifetime member, presenting him with a special jacket that combined his old MP patches with their current insignia. That evening, as Harold sat on his porch watching Snake teach some newer riders the proper way to maintain their bikes, Thunder walked up and sat beside him. "You know," Thunder said with a chuckle, "when you called me last year, I thought we were going to have to run those boys out of town. Never expected it to turn out like this." Harold smiled, looking at his garden where young riders and veterans mingled, sharing stories and laughter. "Sometimes people just need to be reminded of what's right," he said. "And sometimes it takes a whole lot of motorcycles to do the reminding." As the sun set on Maple Street, the sound of motorcycles could still be heard. But now, instead of chaos and disruption, there were sounds of respect, friendship, and brotherhood. Snake's gang had learned that being tough wasn't about making noise or causing trouble. It was about standing for something bigger than themselves. And Harold, watching from his porch with a cup of coffee in his hand, knew that his legacy would live on through these young riders who had become not just his students, but his family. The roses in his garden bloomed brighter than ever, a testament to how something beautiful can grow from even the most unlikely beginnings.